The glittering cities suddenly came to a halt when Arab countries banned crude oil exports in October 1973 because of the Arab-Israeli war. Half of the world seemed to stop. Crude oil prices skyrocketed overnight. Petrol, diesel, and gas prices touched the sky. People's lives were disrupted. Powerful countries like the United States were pushed toward economic collapse. Factories were shutting down, and major oil companies were on the verge of crisis. This incident revealed the true power of oil to the world. From that point onward, people began to understand that crude oil, often called black gold, was no less valuable than real gold. But have you ever wondered where and how crude oil was first discovered? How did people survive hundreds of years ago when oil did not exist? And who controls oil prices today? The history of oil is extremely old. Over millions of years, organic matter transformed into hydrocarbons, which eventually became crude oil. Usually, crude oil remains buried deep underground in deposits, but sometimes it naturally appears on the Earth's surface. This is why ancient human civilizations already had knowledge of oil thousands of years ago. In ancient Egypt, people used crude oil as medicine because they believed applying oil to wounds helped them heal faster. In 347 CE, crude oil wells were drilled in China. These wells were around 240 meters deep and were drilled using bamboo poles connected together. At that time, however, nobody knew that this same crude oil would one day become famous as black gold. The thick liquid coming from these wells could burn easily, so it began to be used in salt production. Bamboo pipelines carried the oil to salt fields, where it was burned to heat and evaporate salt water, leaving behind salt. When crude oil was discovered in Japan during the 17th century, people there started calling it burning water. In the 19th century, crude oil flowed like water in several places around Azerbaijan. During the 12th century, when the Italian explorer Marco Polo was traveling across the world, he saw crude oil flowing everywhere near a place called Baku on the shores of the Caspian Sea. Despite this, oil was not used on a large scale until the 15th century. People were not even willing to take the risk of using oil for lighting at night. Most people avoided leaving their homes after dark. In special situations, different countries used different methods for lighting. At that time, people hunted special types of fish and stored their bones at home for days. These dried bones were burned to produce light. In America, a fish called salmon, and in Scotland and Ireland, a bird called the fulmar, were burned like candles for illumination. Then, by the 1700s, whalefish began to be used for extracting oil. Large numbers of whales were hunted from the oceans, and small factories were built to process whale oil. This oil was used for lighting, as well as for making perfumes and lubricants. America had a monopoly over the oil produced from whalefish because the country had sent most of its ships into the oceans in search of whales. At that time, the whale oil industry had become the fifth largest industry in the United States. In 1846, a Canadian geoscientist named Abraham Gesner discovered a new type of oil for lighting purposes. Gesner refined oil shale, coal, and bitumen to create an oil that could easily be burned for illumination. This oil was named kerosene oil. The invention of kerosene brought a new revolution to the world. It required fewer resources to produce, and compared to whale oil, it was almost 15 times cheaper. As a result, kerosene production rapidly expanded, and many companies entered the business. With the help of kerosene lamps, people started walking on the streets even at night, because street lamps began appearing everywhere. Even after the success of kerosene, the search for a better fuel continued. Then, in 1858, people in western Pennsylvania, America, noticed black oil continuously flowing out from salt wells. Initially, because of its unpleasant smell, people did not pay much attention to it. However, the substance was identified as petroleum. Around the same time, a man named James Townsend, who was a bank president, thought about making money from petroleum. For this purpose, he asked Benjamin Silliman, a junior professor at Yale University and an expert in chemistry, to analyze the petroleum coming from the salt wells. The investigation produced highly favorable reports. It was discovered that if this petroleum substance was distilled, many valuable products could be produced from it. Townsend already understood the potential of petroleum. In fact, he had already formed the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company along with two partners. However, the company's stocks had not sold well because people still did not fully understand the value and uses of petroleum, kerosene, and gasoline. After this, Townsend met Edwin Drake, a railroad employee who was also searching for oil. Townsend requested Drake to visit the oil regions of Pennsylvania. After touring the region, Drake told him that crude oil could create enormous fortunes. Encouraged by this news, Townsend sold all the stocks of the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company to Drake and promised to pay him $1,000 annually to dig petroleum wells. Soon after, Drake established a company called the Seneca Oil Company, in which he himself became the largest shareholder. In May 1858, Drake arrived in Titusville, Pennsylvania, and planned to begin drilling there. However, the work was far from easy. Very soon, people began mocking him and calling him Crazy Drake. Ignoring the criticism, Drake searched for an expert driller. During this search, he met a blacksmith named William Smith. Smith started working for Drake for a payment of $2.50 per day, and his 15-year-old son also joined the effort. During drilling near a creek, water repeatedly flooded the drilling site, creating major problems. At first, they tried pumping the water out, but it proved extremely difficult. Eventually, Drake and Smith solved the issue by using gas pipes to drill directly into the bedrock so that the water stream stayed above the drilling area. Later, they used a steam engine for drilling, but success still remained limited. Finally, on August 27, 1859, the historic day arrived. Smith successfully drilled down to a depth of 69 feet and struck crude oil. When Drake reached the Titusville site on Monday morning, he saw that Smith and his team had already filled jars, barrels, and tubs with crude oil. After many failures, crude oil had finally been discovered in a rural area about 11 kilometers away from Titusville. The news spread rapidly throughout the region. Soon, drilling operations started everywhere around Titusville, and massive amounts of oil began to be extracted. Within a short time, the entire area became known as Oil City. Initially, around 4,500 barrels of oil were produced there. But within just 4 years, by 1862, production had reached nearly 3 million barrels. With the beginning of oil production in Pennsylvania, an oil revolution swept across America. Oil wells were drilled throughout Pennsylvania, and gradually crude oil wells also appeared in California, Oklahoma, and Texas. Together, these states began producing around 26 million barrels of crude oil. By 1900, annual production had risen to nearly 64 million barrels. Along with this, more than 200 oil byproducts, such as solvents, lubricants, and kerosene, also began to be produced and marketed. Very quickly, America became the world's largest oil producer. Seeing the rapid growth of the oil industry in America, countries all over the world began searching for oil. Every nation hoped that oil might also be discovered within its borders. Some governments invested money into oil exploration, while in other places European companies searched for oil resources. By the beginning of the 20th century, the search for oil had reached the Middle East. A British geologist named George Bernard Reynolds spent nearly 10 years exploring different regions of Persia, which is present-day Iran, looking for oil possibilities. Finally, in 1908, crude oil was discovered in Persia. After oil was found, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, a British company, established its monopoly over the entire region. The company refined the oil and supplied it to different countries around the world. Later, most of the company's shares were purchased by the British government. As a result, most of the profits generated from Iranian crude oil started going directly to Britain. The actions of the British company created anger inside Iran, and conflicts between Iran and Britain began to rise. To resolve the dispute, an agreement was finally signed in 1933 between Iran and the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. According to the agreement, the British would pay Iran a fixed amount of money, and in return, Iran would not interfere in the company's business for several years. During this period, the British gained almost complete control over the crude oil resources around Iran. However, this dominance did not last long. Soon, the Iranian people began to feel that the British were exploiting their country's natural resources for their own benefit. As a result, in 1951, Iran nationalized all oil industries and took control of all the resources owned by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. After crude oil was discovered in Iran, oil exploration spread rapidly across other parts of the Middle East. In search of oil, an American company called the Arabian American Oil Company, commonly known as Aramco, arrived in Saudi Arabia in 1938. At that time, Saudi Arabia was considered one of the poorest countries in the world. Everywhere there was only desert. Very little could be grown except dates. Most people had to migrate to other countries in search of work. The country earned only a small amount of income from Islamic tourism related to Mecca and Medina, but it was nowhere near enough for prosperity. After the end of the First World War, a New Zealand mining engineer named Major Frank Holmes had already predicted the possibility of oil reserves in Saudi Arabia. For years, oil was searched for in different regions, but no major success was achieved. Finally, in 1938, Aramco discovered oil for the first time in a place called Dammam in Saudi Arabia. What shocked everyone was that wherever drilling started, enormous quantities of oil continued to emerge from the ground. Soon, oil wells began appearing throughout the region. Pipelines were laid to transport crude oil to refineries. In 1944, Aramco was given responsibility for extracting oil across the entire area, and from that point onward, the picture of Saudi Arabia completely changed. A country once struggling with hunger and poverty suddenly became extremely wealthy. Saudi Arabia developed so rapidly that it eventually entered the list of the richest countries in the world. Luxurious cars and lavish lifestyles became symbols of wealth there. According to reports, by 2016, Saudi Arabia had already produced around 90 billion barrels of crude oil. It was also estimated that according to 2014 reports, Saudi Arabia still possessed nearly 267 billion barrels of proven crude oil reserves. Similarly, by the end of the 19th century, countries like Russia had also discovered large crude oil reserves. In the countries where crude oil was discovered, oil gradually became the foundation of their economies. Every nation wanted to extract as much oil as possible and export it around the world so that their GDP could continue to grow. At one point, oil supply was very high, while demand was relatively low. Because of this, countries competed fiercely with one another and were even willing to export crude oil at lower prices just to increase exports. This growing competition among oil-producing nations started causing financial losses to many of them. As a result, in September 1960, during the Baghdad Conference, 5 countries came together to form a group called OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. Initially, countries like Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran became members. Later, 8 more countries joined, increasing OPEC's membership to 13 nations. OPEC decides how much oil member countries should produce and at what price it should be exported. However, countries like Russia and the United States kept themselves separate from OPEC and announced that they would decide the prices of their oil independently. Later, in December 2016, OPEC signed an agreement with 10 non-OPEC countries, including Russia and Kazakhstan. After this alliance, the organization became known as OPEC Plus, or OPEC Plus. As oil production around the world increased, machines, industries, and automobiles using oil also expanded rapidly. In India too, large American cars were being imported, but people had no idea that the story was about to take a dramatic turn. In October 1973, the world faced a major energy crisis. The situation became so severe that large American cars like Buick and Impala almost disappeared from Indian roads, and smaller cars like Fiat and Standard Herald became more common. After the Second World War, the world experienced 2 major oil crises. The first oil crisis happened in 1973, when Arab members of OPEC stopped exporting oil to countries like the United States, Japan, and Western Europe. At that time, these countries consumed nearly half of the world's crude oil production. The reason behind this embargo was the ongoing Arab-Israeli conflict, particularly the Yom Kippur War, in which Syria and Egypt were fighting against Israel. Arab countries had always opposed Israel, while Western nations like the United States and Japan were supporting Israel during the war. In response, OPEC imposed an oil export embargo on those countries. Initially, the ban mainly affected countries like Canada, Japan, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and the United States because they openly supported Israel. Gradually, the embargo expanded to include countries like Portugal and South Africa, and oil supplies continued to shrink. As a result, even a superpower like the United States entered a recession. Although the conflict itself lasted only around 3 weeks, its global impact was completely unexpected. The oil crisis affected the entire world so deeply that within just 4 months, by March 1974, when the embargo ended, oil prices had risen from around $3 per barrel to nearly $12 per barrel. During the same period in 1974, the United States prepared a list of 30 developing countries that were most affected by the oil crisis. Unfortunately, India